Good afternoon. So today I'm going to be talking about no-dig gardening in a heritage context, specifically looking at the place that I work, which is here in the kitchen garden at Hampton Court Palace. So the subjects that I'll be briefly covering in this talk is firstly just to give you a quick introduction to Hampton Court Palace and the Royal Kitchen Garden. And then I'll talk about what we do, so the soil cultivation techniques that we use here, and then the authenticity of them, so how they compare to what would have been done historically. And then how well does this work in practice and how our visitors engage with it as well. So this is Hampton Court Palace. It's located in the furthest southwest part of London and is especially famous for its Tudor history, especially the notorious English King Henry VIII. But its rich history also includes the Georgian and Victorian periods. The palace is owned by the Crown, but also run by Historic Royal Palaces, which is a charity that also manages the Tower of London, Kensington Palace, Kew Palace, and Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland. And here's a map of the palace grounds, just to put it into context, the size of the grounds that we're managing here. So the palace sits within a wider estate of Home Park and Bushy Park, and large areas like this are an important feature of the wider London area. The palace is well known for these extensive gardens, and they include the South Front Parterre Garden, which is right next to the river here, and also the East Front Gardens with their great big lawns and these distinctive mushroom-shaped yew trees. So on the opposite side of the gardens to what we've just seen is an area that's known as the Till Yard. This is an area that would have been previously used for jousting in the Tudor times, and today you can still see the towers that were used for viewing sport. From the time of King William and Queen Mary, this area was converted into a kitchen garden to feed the royal household, and this is a plan of it from 1736. And it clearly shows the intensity of the productive gardening at that time and the use of these brick walls to create a warm, sheltered garden that included a lot of fruit. The specimens grown at Hampton Court were used by the writer and artist George Brookshaw in his book Pomona Britannica and used as examples of the highest quality fruit being grown. There was, however, a decline of the gardens by the 1800s, however, when Hampton Court fell out of favour as a royal residence and the vegetable production moved to Windsor instead. The area was leased to some private market gardeners for some time after that. And the use of the area changed again in the 20th century. This part of the gardens was converted to tennis courts, a rose garden, a car park, and a herbaceous area and lawn, reflecting the changes in priorities and what was considered to be important at the time. So where the kitchen garden is today is the area highlighted in green here, and you can see that it's 1/6 of that original size. And the photo on the left shows what the area looked like. So it was a nice park area, but nothing particularly exciting. Then a decision was made to rebuild part of the kitchen gardens in 2014. They used information from the National Archives at Kew, and archaeological surveys were carried out on the site, which showed the evidence of the path layout that you can see here. So this was a major project involving, first of all, a lot of research and planning, and then the site works. So removing trees, building paths, adding drainage, water and power supplies, refurbishing the pond in the corner of the garden, renovating the pavilions that hold the historic garden displays, cultivating the existing topsoil, adding more soil and organic matter, and finally planting with 82 fruit trees, 60 espalier fruit, 180 soft fruit bushes, and 2,500 square metres of vegetables. And there was apparently quite heavy rain during this period, which made the work difficult. The dimensions of the garden are as specified and in historical sources that we have from the 18th century. And it does look very much like what would design today for a no-dig veg garden, with these long strips of cultivated soil, as you often see in modern organic market gardens. And the garden's laid out with 254 small beds of 1.5 by 5 metres, which is a similar layout to the original Georgian kitchen garden, as we saw in that drawing. But this also lends itself very well to no-dig. And there's a rotation system of different groups of crops in the veg beds, such as alliums, brassicas, legumes, and so on. surrounded by a border of red currants, black currants, gooseberries, and dwarf apple trees just here. And then around the far edge, we've got cut flower borders and wall-train fruit trees. It's a warm, sunny garden in the warmest part of the country, and so we're able to grow nice things like peaches and nectarines on the south-facing walls, with cooking apples and morello cherries on the opposite side. The fruit and veg that we grow is mostly sold to visitors, but we've recently started supplying some to the cafe in the gardens as well. We've put displays of seasonal herbs in the Tudor kitchens within the palace. So the garden isn't certified organic, but we try and keep to organic principles as much as possible. I think that organic certification is great from a consumer point of view, as it gives people some idea of the farming standards involved in food production. But here the garden is open to visitors, so it's very easy for them to see where the produce is coming from. They can walk around, they can look at it, and they can talk to the gardeners. So although it's nice to look back at the garden as it is in the summer, this is what it looks like at this time of year as we're partway through our winter mulching. The garden is maintained using mostly a no-dig method. So we won't routinely dig over the soil, but instead we add layers of mulch. And this is what we're doing at the moment, is we're adding a thick layer of compost onto the veg beds. We'll also take this opportunity to hoe and then pack down the gravel paths and to top up the chip bark that forms paths between the individual beds. This helps to suppress the weeds, and having the paths there means that we can avoid standing on the veg beds as much as possible, since we can reach across to the centre of the beds from both sides. Previously, we have used compost that's been made in the wider palace grounds at a site within the park, and materials collected from across the gardens, so from the gardening work that's happening on the east front or the south front, for example, and allowed to break down in huge piles in the works yard. Then a contractor comes around with a huge shredding machine on the back of a truck, and the compost is loaded into this with a JCB, and then it chops it all up into small pieces, and then it's allowed to rot down for another year or so. Because of the mass of the material there, it reaches a really high temperature, but there have been still some uncertainties about contamination with perennial weeds. So this year a decision was made to buy more compost in bulk bags, which are then dropped off at the kitchen garden. We'll then shovel it and barrow it out and spread it on the beds, but we may or may not go back to using the more local product in the future. We do make our own compost within the kitchen garden as well. It's an important part of organic vegetable gardening, and it's good to demonstrate how it works. Our compost heap has 3 large bays, with the new material constantly be adding to this first bay, and then each part of it gets turned by hand into the next bay about once every 6 weeks. When the compost is ready to be used, we'll sieve it using this homemade device here. So one person scoops up the compost onto the metal grid here, and then we shake it and rake it around so that the larger sticks and rocks are removed. And then we use it as a mulch directly on top of the soil. Another technique that we sometimes use is hotbeds. And this is a very old technique, as forcing crops to make them productive out of season is always been something that gardeners have tried to do, especially in the context of royal or wealthy people's gardens. There's a great example of this at the Lost Gardens of Heligan in Cornwall in England, where they have been used to great effect to grow pineapples even. These beds work by making a thick pile of fresh manure and then covering it with the growing medium. As the manure ferments, it gives off heat, raising the temperature of the hotbeds, and this allows us to extend the growing season, growing salad in winter, starting earlier in the spring, and then using the residual heat to grow melons in the summer. Here's some coriander that's been grown in the spring in one of these beds. And the photo on the right is the spinach as it looks now. So at the beginning of February, it's growing slowly but surely under the protection of the glass lights. Here's a photo of the hotbeds being created on the left. So you might be able to see the metal pole just there, which we inserted into the fresh manure, which is to test the heat. When these beds are up and working properly, you'll find that when the pole is removed, it's too hot to touch even. However, just to talk about the practicalities of this process for a minute, it involves a lot of effort to dig out the previous year's soil and then fill these beds again. We also have to source fresh horse manure, and it's a messy and smelly process to bring it in on a tractor and to be barrowing it back and forth in a garden that is open to visitors. And although I have had some success with this type of hotbed in the past, these ones unfortunately didn't quite get up to temperature. I think that the issue here might be perhaps the height of the beds, as they're not raised up enough to give enough volume, enough mass to build up that heat that we require. However, with all that manure, once rotted down, it did mean that the soil was rich enough to grow this exceptionally big marrow, which became quite a popular feature in the garden. So these historical techniques can be extremely effective, and it would be great if we could experiment with them more, but we do still have a lot to learn. One more modern technique that we've just started using is the use of strolch, which is a mineralised straw product that's spread on the surface of the soil as a mulch, which helps to suppress the weeds. Now, to look at the authenticity of our soil cultivation techniques, one of the most interesting aspects of a garden like this is being able to look at what we're doing now and to compare it to historical sources. And one of the most important sources that we have is this book, The Retired Gardener, which is a translation of an earlier French gardening text, adapted for English gardens by the royal gardeners George London and Henry Wise in 1706. And this gives us a great insight into the methods that would have been used in Hampton Court at that time. And a lot of these gardening books are available to read online, and I highly recommend giving them a look if you get the chance. I've just chosen to show these pages at random just because I like the pictures, especially their diagram of a tool for getting rid of caterpillars. Yeah. The gardeners at the time did certainly understand the importance of ground cultivation techniques. So the very first subject discussed in The Retired Gardener is the qualities of a good soil. And although they do make the point that it seems counterintuitive to invert the soil layers when this isn't what happens in nature, as they describe it, there are layers of good and bad soil. So what it says up here, like the top earth is always allowed to be better than that which lies underneath it, either by being dung by cattle, sweetened by the air, made productive by tillage, etc. The best part of the earth must nevertheless, according to his directions, be laid 3 feet within the ground. Now, what can be more absurd? Having said that, though, the emphasis at that time was very much on digging, and they took digging the soil very seriously indeed. The whole second chapter in the book is, in fact, dedicated to the subject. And so at great length, they describe how you have to dig trench after trench in the earth through the full depth of the soil profile, and even describing how to dig a trench 6 feet deep for planting a fruit tree against a wall, with instructions on how to make sure that the wall itself didn't fall down. They saw, quite rightly though, a great importance in the depth of the soil, and they thought that it was important for the air, the moisture, and the sun's warmth to penetrate through it. So just reading through these pages, it seems like the no-dig technique that we use today is not historically very authentic at all. However, there are some similarities. They go on to say that the organic material should be kept close to the surface of the soil and not dug right into the bottom of the trench. And interestingly, actually, I think we had a question about this just after the first section of talks that we had this morning, but they do say in 1701 about the use of leaf mould as a mulch to protect the new seedlings from heavy rainfall and from late frosts. And as they say, it happened in the months of March and April 1701. So it's nice to be able to get these details about what happened from these texts as well. And they also describe the addition of manure as a coin with which to repay the earth, which I think is a lovely way of thinking about it. So when we're working in a garden such as Hampton Court, we have to always be asking ourselves questions about the historical accuracy of what we're doing versus the modern day practicalities. It's a functioning garden and not a living history display, so we need to find a balance between the two. For example, we use a lot of netting in the garden, which is vital to protect our plants from birds and insect pests. We have a lot of trouble with allium leaf miner and leaf moths, which are becoming more widespread in the UK with a changing climate. And so it's something that we have to deal with now that probably wasn't an issue back in the 1700s. And we need to produce good quality fruit and veg. Our customers are used to getting food from the supermarket, and they won't appreciate finding a caterpillar in their broccoli. In some cases, it makes more sense to use the technology that's available to us, as the Georgian gardeners would have done, being great innovators themselves. When we're deciding what to grow, we do consider a lot of old-fashioned cultivars, though. Some of these varieties, such as the heritage tomatoes, have a fantastic flavour, not having been bred for easy transport and long shelf life, like some of our more modern ones. It's important to grow them in order to preserve their genetics for future generations. However, we do grow some modern varieties that have been bred for improved vigour or pest and disease resistance. Since the garden's open to visitors, we want to make sure that it looks good. So again, it's just about finding that balance. So moving on to talk about how well the no-dig works in practice. First of all, visually, it looks great. We've got these neatly mulched beds and it looks really neat. The disadvantages are that when it rains, the compost does tend to wash off the bed slightly, which doesn't look quite so great. And we also have some birds here that like to flick the mulch everywhere as they look for food. Although digging would be messy, we do spend a lot of time trying to keep the paths clear of soil and weeds, since the beds don't have any edges of them. And the sourcing of compost has posed a couple of challenges as well. As I mentioned before, we need to make sure that the compost isn't introducing any new weeds into the garden. And we have to think about whether it's better to buy in compost, or perhaps from an environmental perspective, if it's better to use what the gardens here produce. In their book that I talked about earlier, London and Wise specifically refer to the soil in this area as a sandy, loamy soil of greyish colour, has answered all that we could expect of a good earth, which is a very positive description. And probably if we were digging the soil as they were, it would become more manageable. However, we're still close to the River Thames here, and the soil is quite silty and full of stones. So growing in layers on top of it does seem much easier. It's much softer to plant into, and the weeds can be hoed off with very little effort, compared with areas where the mulch hasn't been added. So with improved soil health, we get better soil diversity as well. As gardeners looking after a piece of land, we have a responsibility for the animals, the plants, and the fungi that live here. So the biodiversity is important too. The layout of the garden presents us with some challenges as well. So with many beds and different types of vegetables growing, it is a lot of work. This is a really intense form of gardening. Each one of these 254 beds might have 2 or 3 different crops or successional plantings each year. So logistically, that takes a bit of organisation. And although the mulching process does certainly help with the suppression of weeds, we do have some issues with perennial weeds, in particular bindweed. Part of the reason for this is that the pandemic unfortunately hit the Historic Royal Palaces organisation very hard in the past years. And during much of 2020, the garden was completely closed off due to restrictions on the palace opening to the public and the gardens team not being able to come into work. This meant that the garden did become very overgrown for this period. This photo was taken in July 2020, and although it looks quite colourful at this stage, the garden really wasn't being maintained, and a lot of those weeds were allowed to go to seed. So we've got an additional load of weed seeds and perennial weed roots in the soil to have to manage now. We now have a reduced number of staff to look after the gardens. There's only 2 of us in the kitchen garden, plus a great team of volunteers. But we do have other demands on our time, such as caring for the grapevine, which also lives at Hampton Court. However, the team has worked extremely hard, and I'm very proud of them as they've got the garden back into a good state again. Included in the design of this garden are areas of green manure, which are grown in different parts of the garden as part of the crop rotation. This has got many advantages because it adds nutrition to the soil, it improves its structure, it helps to hold the soil together, and it's a useful organic growing technique to demonstrate. And it's also historically quite accurate, as the old gardening books describe growing legumes to enrich the soil before planting other crops. Periodically, we cut it down by hand using a scythe, which you might just about be able to see on the wall behind me. And although you might not usually allow green manure to flower, we actually did that last year with our mixture of buckwheat, phacelia, clover and alfalfa. And it looked absolutely amazing and was filled with lots of bees and other insects. However, green manure isn't generally included in a no-dig garden, and it leaves us with the question as to how to get rid of it when we want to plant something else in that area. In the 1700s, they would have added a load of manure and then gone about their process of digging trenches and mixing the soil up. But if we wanted to keep with the no-dig method, we'd have to spray it, which isn't what we want to do in an organic principle garden. Or we would have to cover it to exclude light, and having black plastic and bricks on the ground is fine at the allotment, but it doesn't look great in a historic palace garden. We've tried digging it over and leaving it on the surface of the soil, but that takes time to break down, and we really want to be planting into the soil as soon as possible in the spring. So what we're trying at the moment is just digging out the remaining clover and then adding it to the compost heap, and then adding a compost mulch on the surface of the beds. So it's a minimal dig rather than a no-dig system, but I'm definitely open to suggestions if anybody has any other ideas. One of the other slight disadvantages to adding all this mulch in the winter is that sometimes we still have crops growing in the beds. For example, we'll have spring cabbages, which are planted in August, and winter salads and pak choi growing over winter. Garlic, which is also growing through the coldest months, is easy enough to mulch around, but we have to mulch the other beds here at slightly different times of the year. And finally, I'll talk about how the visitors engage with all of this. Most importantly, we have to look at the bigger picture, I think. The majority of visitors are here for a day out and to visit the palace and its wider gardens. Families make up a large number of visitors, and for children we have this area called the Magic Garden in this photo here. It's just basically a big play area with this great big dragon in it, so frequently that becomes the focus of their visit. A lot of people also come for the garden festival, which is held on this site every year, as well as lots of other events. So the focus isn't necessarily on the kitchen garden itself, although many people do walk around and enjoy it. We do have plenty of interest though. Lots of visitors ask questions, and frequently we do get asked about no-dig. There's been a lot more interest recently, with many more people starting to grow their own vegetables for the first time, and new allotment holders who want to learn about it. It's a really broad subject, so we've started running occasional courses in the kitchen garden. These have included an introduction to grow your own, kitchen garden skills day with the Working for Gardeners Association, design students from Kingston Landscape College coming and spending a week in the garden, and hopefully we'll do more of that in the future. One of the most significant ways that we interact with the public is by selling the produce from the garden. It's really popular and it allows visitors to take home some fresh produce. We did previously do a market sale in the garden once a week, but it got incredibly busy in the summer, and rather than trying to get all the harvesting done in one morning, we found it's easier to just put something out on the stall most days with an honesty box in place. We also take volunteers to help out in the kitchen garden, which is becoming a large part of the garden's workforce. They do a valuable job helping us with weeding, harvesting, and general maintenance of the garden. There are regular volunteers that come in every week, forming an important community connection. And Hampton Court is a much loved garden, so there is a demand for positions whenever they become available. We hope that by engaging with visitors, having volunteers and running courses, we'll get more people interested in veg gardening, or even just to think about how food is grown or the history that there is here, or just to take an interest in the environment around them. And finally, we hope to make more connections with other gardens and share knowledge between us. And I hope that's something that we've done today at this webinar. Thank you.